What's up, everybody? This is chapter 3 of Michael Heinrich's The Science of Value. The sections of this chapter are, the chapter's titled Anthropology as Critique, the Theoretical Conception of the Young Marx, and it has the headings Marx is a Young Hegelian, Critique of Hegelian Philosophy, Critique of Politics, Human Emancipation and Revolution, Critique of Political Economy as a Science within Alienation, Human Essence, Critique of Hegelian Philosophy continued, Communism, Primordiality and Utopia, Moments of Dissolution, a Marxist Conception. So here we are, and this is also the first chapter of part 2, which is titled Marx's Scientific Revolution. So here we are. Chapter 3, Anthropology as Critique, the Theoretical Conception of the Young Marx. Marx's critique of political economy aims to do more than merely criticize individual theories within political economy. It seeks to critique political economy as a science. Marx himself speaks of an attempt, quote, to revolutionize a science, end quote. To meet this challenge, the theoretical field upon which political economy is founded must be subjected to critique. The critique of political economy must effect a rupture with this field, a rupture that can only be achieved through the construction of a new conception of reality and of science. An examination of this rupture leads first to the question of which of Marx's works actually broke with the theoretical field of political economy. For Marx intended to provide a critique of political economy not only in Capital, but as early as the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. Thus, the question regarding the theoretical content of this rupture also raises the issue of continuity and discontinuity in Marx's own theoretical development. Marx's work was interpreted, both by the social democracy of the German Empire and by the newly formed communist parties of the Third International in terms of a more or less linear cumulative progression. The development of Marx's theory was viewed as the formation of a definitive doctrine, a process involving the elimination of initial errors and an increasing engagement with economic questions, ultimately culminating and concluding in the book Capital. All too often, however, his economic work was received in a reductionist, quote, economistic manner, as seen, for instance, in the work of Kautsky, parenthesis, 1887, and parenthesis, who, following Engels' death, was regarded, not least within German social democracy, as the quasi-official guardian of Marxist orthodoxy. Problems were perceived only in areas Marx had not yet analyzed, rather than within Marx's theory itself. This harmonious picture was called into question by the publication of Marx's early writings, specifically the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which had never been published during his lifetime. The Marx who examined alienated labor was not the Marx of Capital, understood in economistic terms. In the prefaces to the Omega, which published many of these early writings for the first time, they were somewhat disparaged as early works that, while brilliant, were still immature. Conversely, bourgeois and social democratic circles championed the young, quote, humanist Marx as the, quote, true Marx, at times pitting him against the older, quote, economistic Marx, as seen, for instance, in the widely varying approaches of De Man, 1932, Landshut, 1932, Thier, 1957, Fromm, 1961, and Fetcher, 1967. Left-wing critics of orthodoxy, by contrast, sought to preserve the unity of the body of work, but interpreted it through the lens of the early writings rather than the late ones, e.g. Marcuse, 1932, Lefebvre, 1940, 1958, Lukács, 1955, Kozik, 1960, Garrodi, 1964. Althusser, 1965, posed the question regarding the relationship between the early and late Marx in more radical terms. While the debate had long centered on various authors assigning weight based on subjective preferences to what constituted the, quote, true Marx, Althusser raised the question of the characteristics of a specifically Marxist science, parenthesis, viewing traditional answers such as, quote, materialist or, quote, dialectical as labels for the problem rather than as solutions. According to Althusser, Marx discovered a new, quote, continent of science, the science of history, thereby making a radical break with the prevailing scientific problematic of political economy and idealist philosophy. However, this epistemological break also exists between the writings of the early and the late Marx, since the early Marx remained bound to the old problematic in the structure of his discourse. However, these widely divergent interpretations reflect not only the interpreters' differing substantive approaches, but also fundamental problems of interpretation that arise with works other than Marx's. When interpreting a series of an author's text rather than just a single one, the constructive element of interpretation, mentioned in the introduction, becomes far more apparent, and even though interpreters rarely account for this to themselves or their readers. In additive interpretations, for instance, an author's various texts are viewed as constituent parts that merely address different topics, yet can readily be canonized into a unified, complete body of work, This approach establishes a uniform theoretical space that, while occupied by individual works at different points, is filled by them in a structurally identical manner. Naturally, the potentially distinct problematics of the individual text are lost in such compilations, which often present themselves as introductions to an author's entire work. Teleological interpretations, by contrast, view the various works as stages along a path toward a specific goal. While the individual texts are accorded differing theoretical statuses, a yardstick applicable to all of them is constructed. Only such a measure allows one to distinguish between what is, not yet fully developed, and what is, already fully developed, Aside from the tendency to project a quasi-determined trajectory onto the author's intellectual development, this approach invariably results in an interpretation focused solely on the, mature work, the telos toward which the development trends. The telos towards which the development tends. For the other texts are understood only within the framework of that mature work's problematic. In this respect, interpreting them may indeed supplement the mature work and prevent hasty, additive readings. Yet, the question of whether the earlier texts possess a distinct problematic of their own is systematically disregarded. Even interpretations that take an author's various texts seriously as independent works and potentially identify, ruptures within them are not free from constructive elements. The very act of identifying a theoretical shift as the expression of a rupture constitutes a constructive act. After all, not every change in an author's work can be construed as a break with their previous problematic. Yet the criterion for determining whether or not a change constitutes a rupture cannot be external to the text itself, for that would mean viewing the text merely as a component of a broader, already interpreted text. Rather, this criterion is itself an integral part of the interpretation of the rupture. It must be substantiated within that interpretation. The aim here is not to trace the details of Marx's early intellectual development. Instead, the goal is to elucidate the theoretical problematic that structures the discourse of these various works. In the following chapter, I will attempt to show that Marx broke with precisely this problematic after 1844. New section. Marx is a young Hegelian. Marx's surviving abitur essays from 1835 reveal the influence of Enlightenment humanist moderately liberal environment in which he grew up. After completing his secondary education, he studied law, first in Bonn and then in Berlin. In Berlin, he was primarily occupied with Hegelian philosophy, and through the Doctors Club, he became acquainted with the leading figures of the emerging young Hegelian movement. As he wrote to his father in November 1837, the grotesque rocky melody of Hegelian philosophy did not initially appeal to him, yet during discussions in the Doctors Club, I chained myself to the prevailing philosophy of the world from which I had intended to escape, Marx. Young Hegelian philosophy became the starting point of Marx's intellectual development. By the 1830s, Hegelianism had become the official state philosophy of Prussia, championed intellectually by the so-called, quote, Old Hegelians. One of the pillars of this state philosophy was Hegel's reconciliation of philosophy and religion. For Hegel, both religion and philosophy shared the same content, differing only in form. To him, God and reason, existing in and for itself, were identical. The young Hegelians, by contrast, rejected this reconciliation of philosophy and religion as a mere, quote, accommodation. Their critique of religion brought them into their initial conflicts with the Prussian, quote, Christian state. Above all, they interpreted Hegel's identification of reason and reality as a justification of the status quo. For the young Hegelians, reason and actual existence were in fact at odds. Viewing the history of philosophy as having reached its culmination in the Hegelian system, they saw their historical mission as the, quote, realization of philosophy, end quote. That is, the transformation of reality through philosophy. Hegelian philosophy was now employed not to affirm the existing order, but to critique it. This critique was not limited to religion. It grew increasingly radical, eventually extending to the state and politics. For several years it served as the philosophical vehicle for the rising liberal bourgeoisie's critique of reactionary conditions in Prussia. In Berlin, Marx became a close friend of Bruno Bauer, the leading figure of the young Hegelian movement. Bauer advocated a philosophy of, quote, self-consciousness, end quote. He held that all history was nothing more than the progressive development of self-consciousness, a concept that in Bauer's view hovered between an individual and a super-individual principle. Self-consciousness, he argued, realizes itself within a historically specific substance, yet this substance eventually becomes a fetter on its further development, necessitating its replacement by a higher form. Bauer developed in particular a critique of religion. The Gospels, he argued, were not divine revelations but the work of their authors. Authors who in turn merely expressed a specific historical stage of self-consciousness that was by then obsolete. The dominance of religion was the expression of an alienated state. The destruction of religious consciousness was the prerequisite for making the world, quote, rational. Ultimately, Bauer expected a transformation of political conditions to result from a transformation of religious consciousness. Marx's dissertation, written in 1840-41, but only partially preserved, titled The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature, is heavily influenced by Bauer's philosophy of self-consciousness. The very choice of subject appears to have been determined by the young Hegelians' attempt to use post-Aristotelian philosophies to ground their own philosophical views. Bauer had also coined the distinction between an, quote, esoteric, authentic Hegel and a, quote, exoteric Hegel, who had made compromises with religion and had sought to turn authentic Hegelian philosophy against its exoteric aspects. In Marx's dissertation, this method of critiquing Hegel is distinguished from a merely moral critique that reproaches Hegel for his conformism. Indeed, it is formulated as a program for reconstructing Hegelian philosophy. For Bauer, the means of progress in the development of self-consciousness was critique. It is the negative element that dissolves the obsolete substance of self-consciousness and drives further development. Marx shares this concept of critique, which implies that theory is the, quote, strongest practice, end quote. Bauer, in a letter to Marx, as is evident from a note regarding a lost section of his dissertation, quote, it is a psychological law that the theoretical spirit, having become free within itself, turns into practical energy, emerging as will from the shadow realm of Amentes, Amenties. It turns against the worldly reality that exists independently of it. Yet the practice of philosophy is itself theoretical. It is critique that measures individual existence against the essence and particular reality against the idea, end quote. Marx. Here the theoretical coordinate system of Marx's thought at the time is already outlined, the contradiction between essence and existence, idea and reality. However, the, quote, idea, against which a specific reality is measured, must not be misunderstood as a mere moral imperative. The idea denotes not a moral postulate, but rather an essence recognized through reason. While the substantive definition of this ideal essence, as well as that of the reality being criticized, and the mode of critique would undergo significant changes over the following years, the structure of the discourse itself would not initially change. In this respect, one can speak of a unified theoretical problematic underlying the young Marxist thought, persisting beneath the various substantive positions that the literature labels as, quote, objective idealist, unquote, quote, anthropological materialist, unquote, and so forth. Marx initially drew the substantive content for these concepts of essence from the Hegelian tradition. When he began his journalistic career at the Rheinische Zeitung in 1842, he was counted among the young Hegelians. As the organ of the liberal Rhineland bourgeoisie, the Rheinische Zeitung was critical of the semi-feudal Prussian state from the outset. In his contributions, Marx engaged primarily with the reactionary Prussian authorities. He sought to apply the model of critique from his dissertation, measuring a, quote, specific reality against the, quote, idea, to his journalistic work. In one of his first articles, he contrasted the, quote, worldview of semblance, unquote, with the, quote, worldview of essence, unquote, and declared programmatically, quote, we must therefore apply the measure of the essence of the inner idea to the existence of things, unquote. Marx. Marx shared the Hegelian-derived conception of a, quote, rational state that stands above classes and is committed solely to the common interest, a state in which the essence of man, freedom, is to be realized. The, quote, newest philosophy, unquote, that of the young Hegelians, according to Marx, quote, views the state as the great organism in which legal, moral, and political freedom is to find its realization, and in which the individual citizen, in obeying the laws of the state, obeys only the natural laws of his own reason, of human reason, end quote. Marx. As the, quote, realization of rational freedom, end quote, the state is therefore to be developed not from religion, but from, quote, the rationality of human relations, a task accomplished by philosophy, end quote. In this conception of the state, the free press plays a crucial role as a mediator between government and people, between administration and the administered. Through his critique, Marx aims to reach more than just the liberal public sphere. He also seeks, via the medium of this critique, the press, to enlighten the actually existing state regarding its true nature. During this phase of idealistic liberalism, Marx still explicitly rejected communism. It was during the debate in the Provincial Assembly regarding the law on wood theft that Marx first had to grapple with economic issues. He perceived the landowner's attempt to legally ban the poor population from gathering wood, a practice based on customary right, as an attempt by private interests, represented by the Provincial Assembly, to instrumentalize the state, a move the state was bound to resolutely reject. During the disputes regarding the impoverishment of Mosella wine growers, Marx was once again confronted with economic issues and made the following observation. Quote, when examining the state of affairs, one is all too easily tempted to overlook the objective nature of the relationships and to explain everything in terms of the will of the individuals involved. Yet there are circumstances that determine the actions of private citizens and individual authorities alike, and are as independent of them as the method of breathing, end quote. Marx. This insight into the objective nature of social relations likely provided Marx with his initial motivation to engage with economics. Marx's commitment to the interests of the impoverished population steered Marx's views on the state in a radically democratic direction, a shift reflected in his final articles for the Rheinische Zeitung. Yet his staunchly democratic stance remained rooted in an idealist foundation. For instance, during the debate on the estates committees, he demanded that the body constitute a form of, quote, self-representation, end quote, of the people, only to immediately link this concept back to an ethical ideal of the state. Although Marx was becoming increasingly aware of conflicting social interests, he remained bound by idealist notions, specifically the idea of, quote, spiritual forces, end quote, that ought to find embodiment in a, quote, genuine representative body, and the concept of an ethical common interest destined for realization in the, quote, true state. However, the inadequacy of these ideas soon became apparent. The substantive definitions derived from the Hegelian tradition, which initially served as the benchmark for Marx's critique of actual conditions, could not withstand the encounter with reality once they were confronted, not merely with political institutions and its laws, but with economic conditions themselves. His theoretical framework was further challenged by his political experiences. The state remained deaf to attempts to enlighten it regarding its true essence. Both the difficulties inherent in trying to grasp social reality through idealist young Hegelian categories and the failure of the political strategy based upon them precipitated an initial theoretical crisis in Marx's development. He found himself compelled to subject the theoretical foundations he had previously taken for granted to critical scrutiny. 2. New section. Section 2. Critique of Hegelian philosophy. In the spring of 1843, the continued publication of the Rheinische Zeitung was banned. A major reason for this ban was the articles written by Marx. Even while working for the Rheinische Zeitung, Marx had increasingly distanced himself from the young Hegelian's critique, which was becoming ever more abstract, but it was only now, under Feuerbach's influence, that Marx truly began to move beyond young Hegelian positions. Feuerbach's piece, Preliminary Theses on the Reform of Philosophy, appeared in February 1843. Feuerbach's philosophy offered Marx a way out of his own theoretical crisis through his critique of Hegelian speculation. Feuerbach provided not only a method for criticizing existing philosophical foundations, but above all a concept of alienation that allowed, quote, irrational reality to be understood precisely as alienation, rather than merely contrasted with reason, as had previously been the case. In the Preliminary Theses, Feuerbach had accused Hegel of inverting subject and predicate. He argued that the absolute spirit, which according to Hegel reveals itself in philosophy, was nothing other than the abstractly conceived, finite human spirit, a human predicate that Hegel had transformed into an independent subject. This inversion of subject and predicate thus provided Feuerbach with a program for the reform of philosophy. In the summer of 1843, Marx wrote the manuscript Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, in which Feuerbach's influence is clearly evident for the first time. Marx sought to subject Hegel's philosophy of right, the limitations of which he had encountered during his time at the Rheinische Zeitung, to a fundamental critique. In doing so, his critique is methodologically entirely committed to Feuerbach's program of inverting subject and predicate. Quote, subjectivity is a determination of the subject, Quote, subjectivity is a determination of the subject. Personality is a determination of the person. Yet instead of grasping them as predicates of their subjects, Hegel treats the predicates as independent entities and subsequently has them transformed into their subjects in a mystical manner. Hegel treats the predicates, the objects, as independent, but he does so in isolation from their actual independence, their subject. Consequently, the actual subject appears as a result, whereas one ought to start from the actual subject and examine its objectification. Marx. Here, Marx is not merely criticizing Hegel's idealist hypostatization of ideas. Rather, this is an empiricist, nominalist critique of the use of abstractions, drawing on Feuerbach's notion that sensory perception is the primary source of knowledge. Both Hegel and Feuerbach started from the opposition between sensory experience and thought. Sensory reality contains only particulars which, once articulated, require the universal, something that exists only in thought, while Hegel drew the conclusion that true reality should be accorded only to the ideal universal. Feuerbach concluded that abstractions, insofar as they fail to capture the sensory, are themselves expressions of alienation. Marx took up and sharpened this nominalist critique of Hegel's use of abstractions a little over a year later in The Holy Family. Yet this was by no means the final word in Marx's critique of Hegel. As the section on method in the 1857 introduction demonstrates, Marx did not remain within the empiricist nominalist positions adopted here. This implies a different critique of Hegel, though one he only sketched out. See the next chapter. Despite all their criticism of Hegelian abstractions, neither Feuerbach nor Marx, even in 1843, contented themselves with the sensory particular. Instead, they aimed to understand the, quote, human essence, unquote. They replaced Hegel's speculative thought with an empiricism that was no less speculative. In doing so, Feuerbach sharply distinguished his form of philosophy from Bauer's philosophy of, quote, self-consciousness. For Feuerbach, quote, man takes the place of abstract self-consciousness. When Marx applies Feuerbach's method of critique, the inversion of subject and predicate, to the philosophy of right, the, quote, real subject from which one must proceed is, in this context too, the human being. For Marx, the human being is now the entity against which reality is measured. Marx sees the alienation of the human being from his species life primarily in the separation and autonomization of the political sphere from actual social life. The consequence of the separation of the state from civil society The consequence of the separation of the state from civil society is, quote, a separation of the political citizen, the citizen of the state from civil society, from his own actual empirical reality, end quote. Consequently, the, quote, real human being, end quote, is merely, quote, the private individual of the current state constitution, end quote. For Marx, the state is no longer simply the realization of human freedom, but rather, quote, the highest social reality of the human being, end quote. The, quote, objectification of the human essence. From this, Marx concludes that democracy is the only form of state that corresponds to this definition of the state. Hitherto, however, the actual existence of the state has been merely the alienated, quote, religious form of its true essence. Since this alienation is essentially political, it must also be overcome politically through, quote, true democracy, end quote. In the context of Hegel's definition of legislative power, Marx encounters the role of private property. If, as with Hegel, private property, in the form of the inalienable landed property, serves as the guarantee of independence from particular interest, and must therefore be given special consideration within the legislative body, then the conclusion inevitably arises that the Constitution is a, quote, constitution of private property, end quote. Consequently, at the end of his manuscript, Marx characterizes private property as, quote, the general category, the general bond of the state, end quote. Thus, his examination of the political sphere provides Marx with the direction his future research must take. In his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx, adopting the method of Hegelian critique pioneered by Feuerbach, was no longer concerned merely with criticizing Hegel on the basis of Hegel's own philosophy, nor with asserting an esoteric side against an exoteric side. Rather, he aimed at the, quote, negation of Hegelian philosophy, end quote, Feuerbach. While one might therefore say, as the editors of the Mega do, that, quote, Marx had shifted to philosophical materialist positions, end quote, the crucial point is that Marx's discourse remains bound to the problematic conflict between essence and existence, idea and reality. The critique of Hegel advanced by Feuerbach and Marx, which inverts subject and predicate, remains grounded in the philosophy of essence. Essence is now understood as the species essence of man, and the reality confronting it is viewed as either its alienated or its true objectification. The critique of Hegel is directed not at the essentialist philosophical approach as such, but at the manner in which this philosophy of essence is executed. However, it is not only the conceptual content of essence and the reality confronting it that have changed, but also the mode of critique itself. The aim is no longer merely to identify contradictions between essence and reality and to hold them up to the actual state with a pedagogical intent. Marx formulates his program as follows, quote, thus, a truly philosophical critique of the current state constitution does not merely point out the existence of contradictions, it explains them. It comprehends their genesis and their necessity, end quote. Marx. This new mode of critique is further developed in the correspondence with Arnold Ruge. Opposing the, quote, doctrinaire teachings of the young Hegelians and, quote, dogmatic communism, end quote, Marx demands that, quote, we quote, that we do not dogmatically anticipate the world, but rather seek to find the new world through the critique of the old, end quote. Marx. This approach is grounded in an idealism of reason. Quote, reason has always existed, though not always in a rational form. The critique can therefore connect with any form of theoretical and practical consciousness, and from the existing forms of reality itself, develop true reality as its, quote, ought and its ultimate goal, end quote. Marx. The critique Marx envisions is no longer addressed, as it was during his time at the Rheinische Zeitung, to a state that is rational in its essence or to a liberal public sphere. Rather, it aims at a, quote, reform of consciousness, end quote. Quote, we do not confront the world in a doctrinaire way with a new principle. ... We merely show it what it is actually fighting for, and consciousness is something it must acquire, even if it does not want to. The reform of consciousness consists only in making the world aware of the world's own consciousness, in waking it from the dream about itself, in explaining its own actions to it, end quote. Marx. The, quote, reform of consciousness, end quote, then, is a matter of enlightening consciousness regarding consciousness's true content, because irrational reality is in fact rational in itself, and the dehumanized, unfree human being is in fact free in itself. It suffices to restore to the human being the consciousness of his own essence, to reform his consciousness in order to make him what he truly is. In the preface to the German Ideology, Marx and Engels would pour scathing scorn on such notions, and already in the two other articles by Marx published in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch of 1844 on the Jewish question and a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right introduction, there is no longer any talk of the, quote, reform of consciousness, end quote, or the rationalist idealism underpinning it. 3. Critique of politics, human emancipation and revolution. In the piece On the Jewish Question, Marx critically engaged with two writings by Bruno Bauer published in 1843. Bauer had responded to the Jews' demand for political emancipation by arguing that no one was yet emancipated in the, quote, Christian state, and that political emancipation presupposed emancipation from religion. Marx accused Bauer of confusing mere political emancipation with, quote, human emancipation. This distinction was based essentially on Feuerbach's concept of the human, quote, species essence, which Marx now employs extensively. In The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach had explained that in religion, man has become alienated from his species essence, that he relates to his own essence as if it were an alien divine one. In his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx had transferred this critical framework whereby one's own species essence becomes autonomous as an alien entity from the realm of religion to that of the state, viewing the political sphere as having become autonomous. There, however, he still saw democracy as the resolution to this alienation. Now, by contrast, he understands the autonomization of, quote, species life as a characteristic of the, quote, fully developed political state, end quote, as well. Within it, too, man leads a, quote, double life, end quote. Quote, life in the political community in which he considers himself a communal being, and life in civil society in which he acts as a private individual, regarding other people as means, end quote. Marx. The abolition of this autonomization, true emancipation, cannot therefore be a political act, such as the realization of democracy. For Marx, the issue is thus no longer merely the critique of specific political constitutions, but the critique of politics as such. Human emancipation is therefore not politically possible. It can only be achieved by reclaiming the alienated species essence for actual human beings. Quote, all emancipation is a restoration of the human world and of human relationships to man himself. Political emancipation is the reduction of man, on the one hand, to a member of civil society, to an egoistic, independent individual, and on the other, to a citizen, to a moral person. Only when the real individual man has reabsorbed the abstract citizen into himself, and as an individual man in his empirical life, in his individual work, and in his individual relationships, has become a species being. Only when man has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers, and consequently no longer separates social power from himself in the form of political power, Only then is human emancipation accomplished, end quote. Marx. However, Marx offers no answer to the question of how man is to become a species being, or who is to bring about human emancipation. In the second part of his article, Marx addresses the economic causes of alienation for the first time. He no longer criticizes merely the fact that species life has become autonomous within the political sphere. Above all, he criticizes the fact that civil society has been able to, quote, tear apart all human species bonds, end quote, and, quote, dissolve the human world into a world of atomistic individuals standing in hostile opposition to one another, end quote. Marx. Marx thus articulates the view that alienation does not originate in the relationship between civil society and the state, but is constituted within civil society itself. He now identifies money as the primary locus of alienation, interpreting it entirely by analogy with religion. There is no longer any talk of the rational nature of the state. Marx recognized that, quote, civil society has completely given birth to the political state out of itself, end quote. Marx. And that political emancipation is therefore merely a limited goal. Marx no longer seeks to enlighten the state or the rational public, nor to reform consciousness. His concern is no longer the conflict between reason and unreason, but rather the alienation of human beings from their species essence. Marx had initially applied this concept, adopted from Feuerbach's critique of religion, only to the relationship between civil society and the state. Now, however, he applies it to civil society itself, seeking the causes of alienation and the possibility of its transcendence within the realm of economics. With this move, he definitively left behind the sphere of young Hegelian ideas and bourgeois democratic demands. The shift toward economics, which took place in 1843 to 44, was likely influenced in no small part by Moses Hess. Let me repeat that sentence. This shift towards economics, which took place in 1843 to 44, was likely influenced in no small part by Moses Hess, the founder and a contributor of the Rheinische Zeitung. In a preface fragment included in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, Marx himself highlights Hess's contribution to the 21 Bogen aus der Schweiz, 21 Sheets from Switzerland, edited by Georg Herweg, 1843. The fact that money plays such a prominent role in the second part of On the Jewish Question, something not foreshadowed in the first part, might even be directly attributable to Hess's essay Über das Geldwesen, On the Nature of Money. Although that essay was not published until 1845, it may well have been known to Marx, given that it was originally intended for publication in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch. Yet for all the substantive evolution of Marx's argumentation, it is undeniable that the structure of his theoretical problematic, even regarding the, quote, Jewish question, remained the same, is the conflict between essence and reality. At this point, a remark seems appropriate regarding the accusation of anti-Semitism frequently leveled against Marx, an accusation anchored primarily in his treatment of the Jewish question. Examples include Zillberner, 1962, Künzli, 1966, who goes so far as to impute, quote, Jewish self-hatred, end quote, to Marx, and Hirsch, 1968, who accuses Marx of proposing the, quote, eradication of trading Jews, end quote, in his discussion of the Jewish question. Even Brown, 1992, who engages with Marx in a nuanced manner, writes, quote, Marx's vilification of the Jews is embarrassing, end quote. Cited as evidence for such charges are passages that appear to characterize, quote, the Jew as an egoistic, self-interested, quote, money man, end quote. What is overlooked, however, is that the anti-Semitic stereotypes prevalent then, as now, such as the notion of the, quote, Jewish huckster mentality, end quote, are, in Marx's argument, projected back onto bourgeois society. The usually Christian bourgeois possesses the very traits of the egoistic money man that are ascribed to the Jew. Thus Marx can write, quote, bourgeois society ceaselessly generates the Jew from its own entrails. What was in and of itself the basis of the Jewish religion? Practical need, egoism, and end quote. Egoism is the principle of civil society, end quote. And when the text states at the end, quote, as soon as society succeeds in abolishing the empirical essence of Judaism, huckstering in its preconditions, the Jew becomes impossible, end quote. Marx. Then the point is not the, quote, eradication of Jews who engage in trade, end quote, but the eradication of trade itself. With this, quote, the Jew, unquote, i.e. the stereotype of the Jewish huckster, becomes just as, quote, impossible as the Christian merchant, regarding the critique of the accusation of leveled against, regarding the critique of the accusation of anti-Semitism leveled against Marx, see Haug 1993 and Clausen 1994. Incidentally, Marx had participated without hesitation in the petition by Jewish communities calling for legal equality. See his letter to Ruge dated March 13, 1843. The second article Marx published in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, Franco-German yearbooks, a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right introduction, begin with the observation that for Germany, the critique of religion is complete. Religion has been recognized as a creation of man. However, he then notes, quote, but man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, state society. This state and this society produce religion, an inverted world consciousness because they are an inverted world. Religion, is the fantastic realization of the human essence because the human essence possesses no true reality, end quote. Marx. By defining man as a social being, Marx already moves somewhat beyond Feuerbach in terms of content, even if this social nature itself remains largely abstract. Crucial, however, is the methodological step Marx takes here, which had already been foreshadowed by the manuscript Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Religion is not simply denounced as inverted consciousness. Rather, it is understood as inverted consciousness springing from an inverted world. Marx thus raises the question of the social causes of man's religious self-alienation. This alters the significance of the critique of religion. It becomes merely the prelude to the actual critique. One must move from the critique of religion to a critique of the conditions that give rise to religion. He justifies beginning this critique of actual conditions with a critique of the philosophy of right by arguing that German reality had not yet reached the historical stage attained by other nations. Only German legal and political philosophy, he maintains, stands, quote, on a par with the official modern present, end quote. Marx. However, this critique of the philosophy of law does not remain self-contained. Rather, it leads to, quote, tasks for whose solution there is only one means, praxis, end quote. Theoretical critique transforms into revolutionary praxis. Yet if a, quote, critique of weapons, end quote, is called for, the question arises as to who is to be the social agent of this revolutionary praxis. Marx argues initially that a political, merely, quote, partial revolution rests on a class of civil society emancipating itself by being able to present its own class interest as the general interest. In Germany, however, no class of civil society is capable of this. While a merely political partial revolution might not be possible in Germany, a, quote, radical revolution, quote, universal human emancipation, end quote, would be. The reason for this lies in, quote, the formation of a class with radical chains, a class of civil society which is not a class of civil society, and a state which is the dissolution of all estates, a sphere which possesses a universal character by virtue of its universal suffering, which in a word is the total loss of humanity, and which therefore can redeem itself only through total redemption of humanity. This dissolution of society as a particular estate is the proletariat, end quote. Marx. Marx no longer speaks as he did in the Rheinische Zeitung and in contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law of a diffuse, quote, poor class, but rather of the, quote, proletariat. He uses this term here for the first time as a historical force. Nor does he limit himself, as in On the Jewish Question, to demanding human rather than merely political emancipation. Marx now declares that human emancipation is possible only through a radical revolution. He views the proletariat as the historical agent of this revolution, thereby definitively arriving at communist positions. since this radical revolution necessarily entails a transformation of economic conditions. The subsequent shift toward economic analysis is a logical consequence. Marx no longer appeals to rational humanity, but rather to a class predestined for revolution by virtue of its social position. However, he can only justify speculatively, and with the aid of Feuerbachian anthropology, the claim that it is precisely the proletariat's social position that endows it with revolutionary potential. Ultimately, it is the contradiction between reality and human essence that is supposed to drive the proletariat toward revolution, while the proletariat as a, quote, suffering class merely feels this contradiction. Philosophy is capable of recognizing this contradiction as a contradiction. The conscious union of philosophy and the proletariat must therefore bring about the revolution. The fact that Marx now identifies the proletariat as the historical subject The fact that Marx now identifies the proletariat as the historical subject of emancipation for the first time is usually attributed to his contact with German and French workers' associations in Paris. However, Kratz pointed out that Marx could not simply assimilate the experience of the proletariat as an agent of social change. This experience inevitably plunged Marx into a theoretical dilemma, given that he had previously, most recently in his correspondence with Ruge, posited a, quote, reform of consciousness, end quote, i.e. theoretical insight guided by philosophical critique, as the prerequisite for practical revolutionary action. Yet the proletariat clearly did not act solely on the basis of philosophical reflection. In this situation, Feuerbachian sensualism, which conceives of the human being not merely as a thinking, theoretical entity, but, above all, as a sensuous feeling being, offered a way out. Alienation could now be understood as something affecting the whole person, not just the realm of thought, but material existence as well. This enables non-theoretical proletarians to experience alienation, and on the basis of that experience to revolt against the alienated conditions. The fact that Marx, as noted above, characterizes the proletariat primarily as a, quote, suffering class is a direct consequence of this view. Feuerbach's Anthropology enables Marx to process the experience of a revolutionary workers' movement theoretically and to move toward communism without abandoning his previous line of inquiry. Even though specific elements of his theoretical framework have changed since his doctoral dissertation, its fundamental structure has remained the same. Reality is measured and criticized against an essence, held up in contrast to it. While the critique was initially undertaken merely in the spirit of Enlightenment thought, the discrepancy between essence and reality is now understood as a necessary alienation that can only be overcome through revolution. The social nature of the human essence, a concept hinted at by Marx, does indeed go beyond the specific content Feuerbach attributed to the human species essence. Yet the extent to which Marx remains committed to the underlying concept of a species essence is evident in the fact that, for him, this essence serves not only as a standard for critique, but also as a means of defining the revolutionary subject. The class most alienated from the human essence must become the agent of the most radical revolution. This defines the terrain upon which Marx's initial engagement with economic theory begins, the discursive structure of Feuerbachian anthropology. 4. Critique of political economy as a science within alienation. In 1844, Marx began the systematic study of political economy in Paris. In his Paris notebooks, he made excerpts from Say and Smith and began drafting Notebook 1 of the economic and philosophic manuscripts, his first attempt at a critique of political economy. The thrust of Marx's critique of political economy is already foreshadowed in the very first economic excerpt. Quote, private property is a fact whose justification is no concern of political economy, yet which forms its foundation. There is no wealth without private property, and political economy is, by its very nature, the science of enrichment. Thus, there is no political economy without private property. The whole of political economy, therefore, rests upon a fact devoid of necessity, end quote. Marx. Here, Marx highlights the existence of private property, a foundation accepted as self-evident by political economy, as a fact that itself requires explanation. Proudhon and Engels, in Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, had previously argued along similar lines. When Marx begins Notebook 1 of the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, Smith represents political economy par excellence for him. Smith had defined the price of a commodity as the sum of wages, capital, profit, and ground rent. Marx builds on this by examining these three relationships in parallel. Contrary to Smith, who simply presupposes the separation of capital, landed property, and labor, Marx maintains that this separation is detrimental solely to the worker. The existence of workers, he argues, has been reduced to that of a commodity, sharing in all the uncertainties of sale. Marx conceives of capital as, quote, purchasing power, end quote, governing power over workers, and landed property as the power of landowners over tenant farmers. Where political economy sees only physical conditions of production, Marx seeks to grasp social relations. Marx initially attempts an immanent critique of political economy. He seeks to reveal contradictions not by applying an external standard, but by adopting the, quote, standpoint of the political economist, end quote. Marx. Quote, let us now place ourselves entirely on the standpoint of the political economist and following him, compare the theoretical and practical claims of the workers. He tells us that originally and in terms of the concept, the entire product belongs to the workers. Yet he simultaneously tells us that in reality, the worker receives only the smallest and most indispensable portion of the product, end quote. Marx. By, quote, theoretical claims, end quote, Marx refers to Smith's labor theory of value, the idea that everything is purchased with labor, that capital is merely accumulated labor, and that originally the entire product of his labor belonged to the worker. In practice, however, the worker receives only the smallest part of his product. Marx concludes, quote, but that labor itself, not only under present conditions, but insofar as its purpose is merely the increase of wealth, that labor itself is harmful and disastrous follows, unbeknownst to the political economist, from his own arguments, end quote. Marx. As becomes particularly clear from the last quote, Marx aims to demonstrate that political economy contains an immanent contradiction, one between the importance it assigns to labor and the actual position the worker occupies in society, a position that political economy itself accepts. Here Marx confronts political economy with the fundamental dilemma of early bourgeois social philosophy. See the first chapter. The need on the one hand to ground property in one's own labor, while on the other having to justify the propertylessness of the working class. The critique of political economy is then further developed at a new level in the famous section on, quote, alienated labor. There Marx summarizes his fundamental critique of political economy as follows. Quote, political economy proceeds from the fact of private property. It does not explain private property to us. It captures the material process that private property undergoes in reality in general, abstract formulas which then serve as laws. It does not grasp these laws, that is, it does not demonstrate how they arise from the essence of private property. End quote. Marx. Here Marx does not merely reproach political economy, as he did in the Say excerpt, for starting with a premise, private property, that itself requires explanation. He distinguishes between what political economy, quote, captures and enunciates as law, and what it, quote, grasps. Marx does not aim for an immediate critique of these laws. He does not accuse political economy of having incorrect laws or failing to capture the actual movement of private property. Rather, Marx attempts to provide a meta-critique of the conceptual foundations of political economy. Marx criticizes political economy's concept of law and the nature of its explanations. Quote, political economy gives us no insight into the basis for the division of labor and capital, or of capital and land. For instance, when it determines the relationship between wages and the profit on capital, political economy regards the capitalist interest as the ultimate reason. That is, it presupposes what it ought to explain, ... The only wheels the political economist sets in motion are greed and the war among the greedy, competition, end quote. Marx. Ultimately, then, political economy argues in terms of interest and greed. that is, in terms of attributes of the commodity owner that have been elevated to the status of anthropological constants. For Marx, however, these attributes presupposed by political economy do not serve as explanatory grounds, rather they themselves require explanation. He therefore defines his own task as follows, quote, "We must now grasp the essential connection between private property, greed, the separation of labor, capital, and landed property, exchange and competition, the value and devaluation of man, monopoly and competition, etc., and the connection of this entire alienation with the monetary system." End quote. Marx. Marx is thus no longer concerned with the immanent critique practiced previously, nor merely with a critique of specific assertions made by political economy. His metacritique of political economy aims at a reconstruction of its subject matter. He believed that he had demonstrated the necessity of this reconstruction through his immanent critique. Marx distinguishes himself from political economy right from the choice of his starting point. Quote, "Let us not place ourselves, as the political economist does when he seeks to explain things, in a fictitious primordial state. Such a primordial state explains nothing, ... We start from a present-day economic fact. The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces, the more his production increases in power and scope. The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. The devaluation of the world of men increases in direct proportion to the increase in value of the world of things." End quote. Marx. Marx bases his argument on a, quote, "present-day fact," end quote, that is also known to political economy. He does not claim to have discovered a new fact, but rather to comprehend a long-known one in a way that differs from political economy. This present-day fact is not merely the pauperization of the workers, but their entire position within developing capitalism. From this, Marx derives the four well-known aspects of alienation. First, alienation from the object of labor. This object confronts him as an alien being, as a power independent of the producer. End quote. Marx. Marx's analysis of the alienated labor follows the same line of reasoning as Feuerbach's analysis of Christianity. Feuerbach conceived of God as the essence of man, which had become independent as an alien entity dominating man. The idea that man is dominated by his own product is the fundamental concept shared by Feuerbach's and Marx's analyses of alienation. Consequently, Marx repeatedly draws parallels to religious alienation. From alienation from the object of labor, Marx immediately infers alienation within the activity itself, since the product is merely the, quote, "summary of the activity," end quote. The worker's alienation from his activity manifests itself in the fact, quote, that labor is external to the worker, i.e. it does not belong to his essential being. His labor is therefore not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need, but merely a means to satisfy needs external to it, end quote. Marx. With this alienation from his own activity, Marx continues, the worker is simultaneously alienated from himself, quote, self-alienation, just as above, there was alienation of the object, end quote. From these first two aspects of alienation, let me read that last quote. With this alienation of his own activity, Marx continues, with this alienation from his own activity, Marx continues, the worker is simultaneously alienated from himself, quote, self-alienation, just as above there was alienation of the object, end quote. Marx. From these first two aspects of alienation, Marx then deduces a third, alienation from species being. Marx had already employed Feuerbach's concept of human species essence previously. Now, for the first time, he provides his own definition of species essence. Marx does not stop at Feuerbach's conception, but expands upon it. Man is a species being not only insofar as he makes the species his object, but insofar as he produces his world. While Feuerbach did define man as an objective being, and unlike the animal, a universal one, he did not take actual material production into account. For Marx, by contrast, labor becomes the central concept. It is the realization of the species' powers inherent in man, the actuality of the human species. Because Marx conceives of labor, productive activity as the actuality of human species life, man necessarily becomes alienated from his species life through alienated labor. It, quote, makes species life a means of individual life, end quote. Marx. The fact that human species being finds an alienated expression in money itself, and that money thereby acquires a, quote, divine power, end quote, is addressed by Marx in the very last section of the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, and in the excerpt notes on James Mill, where he resumes the reflections he began in the second part of On the Jewish Question. While Marx's concept of species being and the correlative concept of alienation goes beyond the content Feuerbach assigns to the term, he, like Feuerbach, views the possibility of alienation from one's species being as rooted in its character as, quote, free conscious activity, end quote. For both Feuerbach and Marx, the human capacity that distinguishes man from the animal, namely the ability to make one's own species essence the object of one's own activity, the ability to make one's own species essence the object of one's activity explains the possibility of alienation. From the preceding analysis of alienated labor, Marx derives a fourth aspect, the, quote, alienation of man from man, end quote. Thus, Marx identifies as a result rather than an unquestioned starting point, as assumed by Smith in, quote, political economy, end quote, the social condition characterized by the atomization and mutual opposition of individual human beings, which forms the basis of competition and greed. Marx had previously criticized political economy for its inability to explain its own central concept, private property. He now attempts to provide such an explanation based on the very concept of alienated labor. Gotta find my spot. Quote, if the product of labor does not belong to the worker but confronts the worker as an alien power, this is possible only because it belongs to another man apart from the worker. Private property thus emerges through analysis from the concept of externalized labor, that is, of internalized man, of alienated labor, of alienated life, of alienated man. Admittedly, we derive the concept of externalized labor or of externalized life from political economy as a result of the movement of private property. Yet analysis of this concept reveals that, while private property appears to be the ground or cause of externalized labor, it is in fact a consequence of it. Quote, Marx. Marx's analysis began with the, quote, fact of political economy, end quote. Through the concept of alienated labor, he claimed to have, quote, articulated the concept of this fact, end quote. By developing capitalist production as a system of alienated labor, which results in private property, greed, competition, etc., Marx reconstructed the subject matter of political economy in a specific way. The economic nexus that political economists merely reproduce without grasping its true nature was traced back by Marx to an anthropological foundation. Marx underpinned the concept of political economy with anthropological ones. The worker became the human being, production became species activity, the product became the objectification of the species essence. Marx translated the well-known economic facts that the wage laborer does not own his product and that his labor is compelled by the need to sustain his life to an anthropological construct, the idea that the human being has become alienated from his own essence. This clarifies the distinction Marx draws between, quote, grasping, fassen, and, quote, comprehending, begreifen, while political economy, quote, grasps the economic nexus. Political economy is unable to, quote, comprehend it anthropologically as an expression of the alienation between the human being and his essence. However, this also implies that political economy is not simply, quote, wrong, Rather, quote, political economy has merely articulated the laws of alienation. Let me repeat that. Rather, quote, political economy has merely articulated the laws of alienated labor, end quote. Marx. Political economy remains bound to alienation. It proceeds uncritically from alienated conditions, regarding them as natural. Political economy is a science only within the framework of alienation. In Notebook 3, having gained a clearer understanding of the differences in the doctrines of individual political economists, Marx grasped the development of political economy as the evolution of a science of alienation that becomes increasingly, quote, cynical. This cynicism of political economy is not the result of the individual narrow-mindedness or vested interest of specific economists, but rather an objective expression of the very conditions existing within alienation that political economy conceptualizes. Political economy treats these alienated conditions as natural and human. The excerpt from Mill, written after the manuscript, summarizes this point as follows, quote, political economy conceives the human community, or the active manifestation of human nature, the mutual complementarity of individuals in species life, and truly human life, in the form of exchange and trade. So we see how political economy fixes the alienated form of social intercourse as the essential, original form that corresponds to human destiny. Political economy, like the actual movement itself, proceeds from the relationship of person to person as that of private owner to private owner, end quote. Marx. Marx clearly recognized the affirmative character of the anthropology found in classical political economy. Political economy views the alienated human being as the true human being. Consequently, capitalist commodity production is seen as the world that corresponds to human nature. Marx does not yet find much to fault in the specific analyses and conceptual formulations of political economy. That criticism comes later. But Marx criticizes the anthropological hypostatization of the commodity producer into the human being par excellence. However, Marx does not criticize the anthropological grounding of economics per se, but rather the specific anthropology of political economy, to which he opposes a different anthropology. Marx did not break free from the anthropologism that characterized the theoretical field of political economy. Both classical political economy and the critique practiced by Marx find their ultimate foundation in an anthropology, in a specific essence of the human being. However, while classical political economy deploys its concept of essence affirmatively, Marx uses his concept of essence critically in relation to actual conditions. Five, human essence. Critique of Hegelian philosophy continued. Marx's concept of human essence, as developed in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, formed the basis for his critique of political economy in 1844. The questions of whether this concept of essence remains constitutive for the critique of political economy found in the Grundrisse and Capital lies at the heart of the debate regarding continuity and discontinuity in Marx's theoretical development. See the next chapter. This concept of human essence will now be examined in greater detail. It was briefly noted earlier that Marx's concept of the human species essence goes beyond Feuerbach's, insofar as Marx conceives the objectivity of the species essence as objective production. For Feuerbach, by contrast, reason, will, and heart were the defining characteristics of human essence. Thus, he viewed religion as the decisive form of human alienation, in which the hidden human essence becomes visible. For Marx, the human essence now becomes visible in a completely different realm. Quote, one sees how the history of industry and the established objective existence of industry constitute the open book of human essential powers. Human psychology presented in a sensuous form which until now was grasped not in its connection with the essence of man, but always merely in an external relationship of utility. For, moving within the confines of alienation, people knew how to grasp as the reality of human essential powers, and as human species acts only the general and as human species acts only the general existence of man, religion, or history in its abstract general essence, politics, art, literature, etc. In ordinary material industry, we have before us in the form of sensuous, alien, useful objects, in the form of alienation, the objectified essential powers of man. End quote. Marx. Historicity is also encompassed within the objectivity of the human species essence, insofar as industry is, quote, the actual historical relationship of nature and thus of natural science to man, end quote. Marx. Marx therefore concludes that, quote, all so-called world history is nothing other than the production of man through human labor, the becoming of nature for man, end quote. Marx. Thus the essential powers of man unfold within historical development. It must be noted, however, that this does not imply a change in the human essence itself. Rather, it is the potentials inherent within it that are gradually realized. The translation looks like it got fucked up a little bit. It says here, Marx, key motifs of Hegel's concept of labor. So maybe that's Marx reproduces key motifs of Hegel's concept of labor, as developed in the section on lordship and bondage in the Phenomenology of Spirit. There, Hegel argued that the bondsman, who is compelled to work for the Lord, demonstrates his superiority over nature and his spirituality precisely through his labor. Consequently, the bondsman is able to recognize himself in the contemplation of the product of labor, his own work. In Marx's thought, this self-recognition within one's own work evolves into the realization of the human species essence. While the concepts of objectivity, as the unfolding of productive forces, and historicity extend far beyond Feuerbach's definitions of essence, Feuerbach's influence becomes clearly evident again in the emphasis placed on the sensuous nature of the human being. Marx highlights that the positive abolition of private property constitutes, quote, the sensuous appropriation of human life, end quote. Quote, private property has made us so stupid and one-sided that an object is ours only when we have it. Thus, the simple alienation of all these senses, the sense of having, has taken the place of all physical and mental senses. The abolition of private property is therefore the complete emancipation of all human senses and attributes, end quote. Marx. However, here too Marx goes beyond Feuerbach by emphasizing the historical nature of human beings, specifically within the realm of the senses, and by maintaining that the formation of the five senses is, quote, the work of all previous world history, end quote. Marx. These characterizations of the human species essence, which extend beyond Feuerbach's views, also lead to an assessment of Hegel that differs from Feuerbach's. In the third notebook of the manuscripts, Marx engages with Hegelian philosophy in 3 lengthy passages. There he accuses the young Hegelians, and Bruno Bauer in particular, of remaining trapped within Hegelian logic despite all their criticism. Only Feuerbach, he argues, maintains a, quote, critical relationship to Hegelian dialectics. Nevertheless, Marx offers a critical comment on Feuerbach's rejection of Hegel's, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, noting that Feuerbach interprets it, quote, merely as a contradiction of philosophy with philosophy's self, end quote. Marx. In contrast, Marx maintains that with the negation of the negation, Hegel, quote, found only the abstract, logical, speculative expression for the movement of history, which is not yet the actual history of man as a presupposed subject, but rather the act of generation, the history of man's origin, end quote. Marx. Marx acknowledges that Hegel, unlike Feuerbach, grasped the historical becoming of man, even if only in a speculative and abstract manner. It is precisely these two aspects, historicity and objectivity conceived as production, as the self-creation of man that distinguish Marx's conception of essence from Feuerbach's, and which Marx also finds in Hegel. Marx therefore concludes, quote, Hegel stands on the standpoint of modern political economists. Hegel grasps labor as the essence of man that proves itself, end quote. Marx. However, Marx criticizes the fact that Hegel conceives of historicity and labor only in a speculative manner, that the labor Hegel recognizes is merely, quote, abstract mental, end quote. This also has consequences for his concept of alienation. Since Hegel sees alienation already present in objectification, Hegel cannot overcome actual alienation, but can only withdraw it into consciousness by eliminating its objectified form. In contrast to Feuerbach, however, Marx identifies a positive element in Hegel, quote, the insight expressed within alienation into the appropriation of the objective essence through the supersession of its alienation, the alienated insight into the real objectification of man, end quote. Marx. For Marx, both political economy and Hegelian philosophy are sciences situated within alienation. Thus, the, quote, philosophical spirit, end quote, is nothing, quote, but the alienated spirit of the world, thinking, i.e. grasping itself abstractly, within its own self-alienation, end quote, which gives rise to the most striking analogy of political economy, quote, logic, the money of the spirit, end quote. Marx. Money in economics and logical abstraction in Hegelian philosophy, both are not merely indifferent to the concreteness of human life, but elevate themselves above it. In both realms, one finds the same inversion of subject and predicate. Marx contrasts these sciences, which remain within the sphere of alienation, with, quote, true materialism and, quote, real science, end quote, of which Feuerbach is the founder. This real science is distinguished precisely by the fact that it grasps human essence not in its alienated form, but in its actual form. However, this actual form still awaits its practical realization in communism. New section, Section 6, Communism, Primordiality, and Utopia. By conceiving the objectivity of the human species essence as objective production, and grasping this as a historical process, Marx effectively undermines Feuerbach's ahistorical anthropology. Sorry, spaced out for a second. Section 6. Communism, Primordiality, and Utopia. By conceiving the objectivity of the human species essence as objective production, and grasping this as a historical process, Marx effectively undermines Feuerbach's ahistorical anthropology. Yet this applies only to the substantive definition of the species essence. The structure of Marx's discourse remains that of an anthropological philosophy of essence. This becomes particularly evident regarding the social nature of the species essence. In Feuerbach's work, this social nature appears merely as the, quote, unity of man with man, end quote. By directly building upon this conception, Marx remains on Feuerbachian terrain. Social reality is understood as the objectification of human essence, and sociality is constituted by the species essence inherent in the individual. Marx explicitly maintains, quote, above all, one must avoid setting, quote, society up again as an abstraction over the individual. The individual is the social being, end quote. Marx. In doing so, Marx proceeds from the same individualism as political economy. Society is constituted directly by the essential characteristics of individuals and can therefore only be understood in terms of these essential characteristics. However, while political economy takes existing society to be the human society, Marx, due to the alienation of human beings from their species essence, observes that existing society is merely the objectification of this alienation, that human beings are separated from true sociality. This true sociality can only be established through communism. Regarding its highest phase, the following applies, quote, communism is the positive transcendence of private property as human self-alienation, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Therefore as the complete return of man to himself as a social, i.e. human being, a return accomplished consciously and embracing the entire wealth of previous development. This communism as fully developed naturalism equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature, and between man and man. The true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-affirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. It is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be the solution. Marx. Here the most important structural elements of Marx's conception of essence and alienation are brought together. Reality is confronted with an ideal human essence, revealing a discrepancy, a conflict between existence and essence, and alienation from one's true nature. This conflict is to be resolved in communism. When Marx speaks of communism as the, quote, return of man to his human essence, this implies an original state in which man still possessed that essence. This implication follows necessarily from the concept of alienation, which can mean nothing other than separation, the loss of an original unity, specifically that of man with his actual true essence. Yet analyzing a state as a loss presupposes the existence of another state prior to that loss. However, Marx does not go so far as to idealize a specific historical phase as one free from alienation, a stance that raises the question of the status of his original state. Even more strongly than in the manuscripts, the Mills excerpts present a contrast between bourgeois alienated society and a truly human social existence. Marx emphatically contrasts the mutual instrumentalization of needs found in commodity exchange with, quote, human production. Quote, suppose we had produced a human being, each of us would have doubly affirmed himself. Suppose we had produced as human beings. Each of us would have doubly affirmed himself and the other in his production. 1. In my production, I would have objectified my individuality and its distinctiveness. 2. In your enjoyment or use of my product, I would have directly experienced the satisfaction of having satisfied a human need and thus of having objectified the human essence. 3. To have been the mediator between you and the species, that is to be perceived by you. So I think this is still a quote. 3. To have been the mediator between you and the species, that is to be perceived by you as a complement to your own being. 4. To have directly created your expression of life within my own individual expression of life. That is, to have directly affirmed and realized my true being, my human being, my communal nature, through my individual activity. My work would be a free expression of life, and therefore an enjoyment of life. Marx. In contrast, the following applies to the current state of affairs. Quote, our productions are not the production of man, for man is man. That is not social production, for it is not the human essence that forms the bond of our productions for one another. End quote. Marx. Here Marx stands on the threshold of utopian socialism. From his Anthropology, he distills a social state corresponding to human essence and contrasts it with reality as an ideal. Consistent with this is Marx's statement elsewhere that, quote, so long as man does not recognize himself as man and does not therefore organize the world in a human way, this communal nature appears in the form of alienation, end quote. Marx. Here it appears as though the transition from the alienated to the non-alienated state were merely a matter of recognition. While Marx eschews the system building typical of utopian socialists, his critique of capitalist conditions clearly draws upon a contrast with a social state befitting man. The underlying moral dimension of this critique, which measures a flawed reality against the true essence of humanity, is obscured by the teleological elements of Marx's conception of history, which posits the realization of human essence as history's ultimate goal. However, such a slippage into forms of utopian social criticism, end quote, and that quote's from Zost, 1980, cannot be easily remedied. Yet Zost assumes otherwise, believing that they have found a, quote, unmistakable correction of previous shortcomings, end quote. Zost, 1980, in the third notebook of the manuscripts written, quote, shortly thereafter. As evidence, they cite the following sentence, quote, that the entire revolutionary movement finds both its empirical and theoretical basis in the movement of private property, that is, in political economy itself, is a necessity that is easily grasped, end quote. Marx. Contrary to the assumption Zost's argument requires, the Mill excerpts were actually produced after Notebook 3. This demonstrates that the, quote, correction of previous shortcomings, end quote, cannot be achieved through mere declarations of faith, which is precisely what the cited statement represents at this stage of Marx's development, even if it anticipates later conclusions. Rather, the identified shortcomings stem from the concept of alienation itself and can therefore only be overcome by a fundamentally new conception. New section, section 7. Elements of dissolution in the Marxian conception. With the economic and philosophic manuscripts, Marx had definitively turned to a new field of inquiry, economics. However, this shift took place using the theoretical toolkit of Feuerbachian anthropology. Marx had conceived of a critique of political economy that aimed not merely at criticizing individual theories, but at criticizing political economy as a science. This critique proceeded by analogy with Feuerbach's critique of religion. Just as Feuerbach had understood religion as a form of human self-alienation, Marx now conceives political economy as the alienation of the human being from his essence. Marx's critique of economics remains trapped within the same theoretical field as the political economy it criticizes. The anthropologism of the Marxian conception has already been described in detail. Just as a specific human essence is constitutive for political economy, so is a specific human essence for Marx's critique. While political economy takes the empirical commodity owner as, the human being, for Marx this figure represents the human being alienated from his essence. Furthermore, one can speak of individualism in Marx's work insofar as society is conceived as the objectification of an essence immanent to individuals. And since the essence of man can be directly apprehended, Marx's concept of science is likewise empiricist. The only feature of political economy not found in Marx is its ahistoricism. However, historicity remains largely abstract in Marx's thought, as it is embedded in the schema of, original unity of the human being with his species essence, alienation, supersession of alienation, and given the essentialist philosophical approach, necessarily remains embedded therein. Marx becomes a critic of political economy not by breaking with its theoretical field, but merely through the way he employs his anthropology. While political economy adopts an affirmative stance towards social reality based on its own anthropology, Marx employs his anthropology as a yardstick for critiquing actual conditions and the political economy that merely reflects them. Due to a shift in subject matter, the focus of Marx's work was not consciousness and religion, as it was for Feuerbach, but rather labor. Furthermore, regarding the substantive content of the concept of the human species essence, Marx had already moved beyond the definitions found in Feuerbachian anthropology. Nevertheless, the structure of Marx's discourse remained shaped by that anthropology. Marx himself was fully aware of his theoretical indebtedness to Feuerbach. In a Preface, as he himself termed it, located at the end of Notebook 3, he not only announced further writings critiquing law, morality, politics, and so forth, but also understood Feuerbach's significance. After mentioning the political, economic, and socialist literature he had consulted, he writes, quote, "Moreover, the critique of political economy, like positive critique in general, owes its true foundation to Feuerbach's discoveries. Positive humanist and naturalist critique dates only from Feuerbach," end quote. Marx. In the months that followed, however, Marx did not write the critiques he had announced. At the end of August, he was visited in Paris by Engels, and the two discovered a far-reaching agreement in their views. They decided to write a joint critique of Bruno Bauer. The result was the Holy Family, or Critique of Critical Criticism against Bruno Bauer and Company. In the meantime, Bauer had developed his, quote, philosophy of self-consciousness, end quote, further into an abstract, quote, pure critique, end quote. For Bauer, the opposing forces were no longer the people and the government, but rather, quote, spirit, parenthesis, in the form of Bauer's critique, end parenthesis, and the spiritless, quote, mass, which he held responsible for the failure of his earlier political ideas. Yet it was precisely in the, quote, mass, parenthesis, the proletariat, in parenthesis, that Marx and Engels saw the future agent of revolution. It was therefore natural that they should wish to subject Bauer and his followers, who remained intellectually influential, to critical scrutiny. In this initial reckoning with the young Hegelians, Marx summarizes some of his findings to date, such as the critique of Hegel's reified abstractions, which also appear in the circle around Bauer. He also criticized Proudhon's critique of political economy as one that had not yet transcended the standpoint of political economy itself, an assessment that resulted from the economic studies he had conducted for the economic and philosophic manuscripts. A new element emerges in the analysis of the connection between ideas and material interests. Marx remarks on the tendency of, quote, history and the, quote, ideas that drive history forward to take on a life of their own. Quote, "The idea has always disgraced itself insofar as it was distinct from, quote, interest. On the other hand, it is easy to grasp that every, quote, interest, asserting itself historically on a mass scale, when it first steps onto the world stage, transcends its actual limits within the, quote, idea, or, quote, conception, and mistakes itself for the human interest par excellence," end quote. Marx. Using the development of French materialism as an example, this link between idea and interest is generalized into a connection between theoretical and practical movement. Quote, "Thus the overthrow of 17th century metaphysics can be explained by the materialist theory of the 18th century only insofar as that theoretical movement itself is explained by the practical shaping of French life at the time," end quote. End quote, Marx. However, once the connection between the production of ideas and practical social life is recognized, ideas can no longer be contrasted with reality as a rational insight into its essence. The problem of the conflict between true essence and actual existence, which had previously formed the structural framework of Marx's discourse, is incompatible with this new conception. Alongside the historicity of the species essence, this introduces a second explosive element challenging the anthropological philosophy of essence. Yet Marx and Engels are far from fully realizing at this stage in the Holy Family. Yet Marx and Engels are far from fully realizing this at this stage. In the Holy Family, Feuerbach is still enthusiastically celebrated in many passages. Nevertheless, the conscious critique of Feuerbach in the months that follow will serve as the medium through which a new, non-anthropological conception, one not based on a philosophy of essence, begins to take shape. Okay, and that's the end of the body, and now it's time for the footnotes, which I'm not going to even try to connect with anything in the text. I'm just going to read them straight. Footnote. In 1927, the first attempt to produce a historical, critical, complete edition of the works of Marx and Engels Mega was launched at the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow under the directorship of David Ryazanov and with the participation of an international circle of scholars. This project is able to utilize the manuscript estates of Marx and Engels, which was housed at the time in the SPD archives. The 12 volumes published by 1935 cover works and letters up to 1848, as well as Engels' Anti-Düring and Dialectics of Nature. Fascism made further work impossible in Germany, and in the Soviet Union, Ryazanov and many of his colleagues fell victim to Stalin's, quote, purges. Regarding Ryazanov, in the first Mega, see Special Volume 1 of Beiträge zur Marx-Engels-Forschung, which I think is Essays in Marx-Engels Research. And footnote. Several accounts of this kind exist, some detailed though somewhat dated, such as the multi-volume work by Cornu, as well as those by Lukács, Kegi, and Lapine. And footnote. Regarding the young Hegelian, see McClellan, 1974, and above all, Peperla, 1985. Fuck. Goddamn thing. Footnote. For instance, Hegel's famous aphorism from the preface to the Philosophy of Right, what is rational is real and what is real is rational. Admittedly, for Hegel, not everything that existed was, quote, real, only that which corresponded to its, quote, concept. Yet Hegel recognized a fragment of the concept even in the most obscure institutions of the Prussian state. And footnote. Regarding Bauer, see McClellan, 1974, Kratz, 1979, Peperla, 1985, and Goldschmidt, 1987. And footnote. The preface states emphatically, quote, philosophy makes no secret of it. Prometheus's confession, quote, in a word, I hate all the gods, unquote, is its own confession, its own verdict against all heavenly and earthly gods who do not acknowledge human self-consciousness as the supreme divinity. There should be none other besides it, end quote. And I'm assuming that's Marx. And footnote. Here Marx uses the concept pair esoteric/exoteric in a manner entirely different from his treatment of Adam Smith's work in Theories of Surplus Value, discussed in the first chapter. And footnote. Marx is fully aware that this young Hegelian, quote, realization of philosophy, end quote, entails a number of contradictions. Above all, Marx notes that it must correspond to the, quote, becoming philosophical of the world, end quote, though he does not elaborate further on this point here. End footnote. Kratz identifies the problematic nature of the, quote, realization of philosophy, end quote, program itself, a program that allows the theories of Bauer, Feuerbach, Stirner, and the young Marx, which differ greatly in detail, to be understood as components of a unified, quote, young Hegelian discourse. However, this program does not itself constitute a problematic. Rather, it can only be articulated on the basis of a specific problematic, the contradiction between essence and reality, with its articulation depending on how, quote, essence and, quote, reality are conceived, end footnote. The older Engels also mentioned that he had always heard this from Marx, quote, it was precisely through his engagement with the law on wood theft and the plight of the Mosella wine growers that he was directed away from mere politics towards economic conditions and thus arrived at socialism, end quote. Engels, letter to Richard Fischer, April 15, 1895, end footnote. Marx is frequently attributed a, quote, revolutionary democratic, end quote, standpoint, for instance by the editors of the Mega or by Taubert. This strikes me as an exaggeration, not only because there is no mention of revolution anywhere, which might be due to censorship, but because Marx seeks to enlighten the state regarding its essence, that is, precisely not to revolutionize it. End footnote. Quote, in a true state there is no landed property, no industry, no material substance that could, such as raw elements, strike a bargain with the state. There are only spiritual powers, and only in their state-like resurrection, in their political rebirth, do natural powers possess a voice within the state, end quote. Marx. And footnote. Footnote. Regarding this function of Feuerbach for Marx, see Althusser, 1964, and footnote. Footnote. Quote, the method of reformist critique applies to speculative philosophy in general, does not differ from the one already employed in the philosophy of religion. We need only turn the predicate into the subject, and thus make it the object in principle. In other words, simply invert speculative philosophy. Then we possess the unveiled, pure, unadorned truth, end quote. Feuerbach. End footnote. Footnote. This dating of Feuerbach's influence contradicts the account Engels gives more than 40 years later in his work Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy of 1888. McClellan, 1974, and Kratz, 1979, have already pointed out that the statements made by the older Engels claiming that, quote, claiming that Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity, published as early as 1841, quote, straightaway reinstated materialism on the throne, end quote, and acted as a great liberation, is inaccurate. In 1842, Engels himself describes Feuerbach's critique of religion as a, quote, supplement to Hegel's philosophy of religion. Kratz also clarified that Feuerbach only shifted to sensualist materialism after the first edition of The Essence of Christianity, a shift reflected in significant changes in subsequent editions. While Marx agreed with the fundamental aspects of Feuerbach's critique of religion, no specific influence of Feuerbach is discernible in Marx's articles from 1842. The anonymous 1842 article, titled Luther as Arbiter Between Strauss and Feuerbach, in which Feuerbach was emphatically celebrated and which was formerly attributed to Marx, most likely originated from Feuerbach himself. That's funny. And footnote. Footnote, quote, the true path is turned upside down. The simplest thing becomes the most complex, and the most complex the simplest. What ought to be the starting point becomes the mystical result, and what ought to be a rational result becomes the mystical starting point, end quote. Marx. This critique of Hegel is almost verbatim from Feuerbach. Quote, the course taken by speculative philosophy to date, from the abstract to the concrete, from the ideal to the real, is an inverted one. On this path, one never arrives at true, objective reality, but only ever the realization of one's own abstractions, end quote. Feuerbach. So I guess that's kind of in relation to, right, like seeing, like kind of like God, in God creating man versus man creating God. That's kind of what I'm getting out of that. And the man creating God is the Feuerbachian position, right? So that's the concrete, going from the concrete to the abstract. End footnote. Footnote. See, for example, the critique of sense certainty in the Phenomenology. End footnote. Footnote, quote, democracy is the resolved riddle of all constitutions. Here the constitution is constantly traced back to its actual basis, actual man, the actual people, not only in itself or in terms of essence, but also in terms of existence and reality, and is posited as its own work. The Constitution appears as what it is, the free product of man, end quote. Marx. Footnote, quote, the political constitution was hitherto the religious sphere, the religion of the people's life, the heaven of its universality, in contrast to the earthly existence of its reality. The political sphere was the only state sphere within the state, the only sphere in which both content and form were of a species nature, the truly universal, yet in such a way that, because this sphere stood opposed to the others, its content also became formal and particular, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Arndt, I think it's Andreas Arndt, 1985, views the, quote, break with speculation, end quote, which allegedly occurred in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, as the decisive turning point in the development of the young Marx. However, Arndt, too, dates the beginning of historical materialism only from the German ideology, which I believe is 1845. Andreas Arndt sees the shortcomings of the economic and philosophic manuscripts primarily in the fact that the critique of speculation itself rests on speculative presuppositions. Yet this implies that the, quote, break with speculation, end quote, identified by Andreas Arndt, took place only at a superficial level. End footnote. Footnote. Marx explicitly contrasts this objectification of essence with Hegel's view. Quote, Hegel starts from the state and makes man the subjectivized state. Democracy starts from man and makes the state the objectified man, end quote. Marx. Luperini regards the exposition of this objectification of essence as the core of the philosophy of law Marx had planned but never actually wrote. End footnote. Footnote. Marx prepared the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, Franco-German yearbooks, together with Ruge. This correspondence was also published there in 1844. However, it must be used with some caution. Ruge likely compiled the 3 published letters by Marx from a much larger number of original letters, which have not survived, and made textual alterations in the process. Engels later wrote to Liebknecht, who intended to republish the correspondence. The quote, Marx told me more than once that Ruge had edited him and inserted all sorts of nonsense, end quote. Engels. While Marx did refer to his 2 essays in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher in his later publications, he never referred to this correspondence. End footnote. Footnote. Die Judenfrage, on the Jewish question. 1843. Die Fähigkeit der heutigen Juden und Christen frei zu werden. The capacity of present-day Jews and Christians to become free. In Georg Herweg's edited volume 21 Bogen aus der Schweiz. 21 sheets from Switzerland. End footnote. Footnote. From this follows a critique of human rights, which Marx summarizes as follows, quote, none of the so-called rights of man, therefore, goes beyond egoistic man. Beyond man is a member of civil society. That is an individual withdrawn into himself, into his private interest and his private caprice, and separated from the community. Far from man being conceived in them as a species being, species, life itself, society, appears rather as a framework external to the individuals, as a restriction of their original independence, end quote, Marx. Quote, man as a member of civil society, unpolitical man, necessarily appears, however, as natural man. The droit de l'homme appear as droit naturel. It becomes clear at this point that while Marx criticizes the affirmative character of the anthropology espoused by natural law philosophers, which declares the egoistic individual to be the very essence of man, he does not criticize anthropology as such. Rather, he contrasts this affirmative anthropology with a critical one based on Feuerbach's concept of the human species being. End footnote. Footnote. In, quote, political democracy, end quote, man is indeed regarded as, quote, a sovereign, as a supreme being, ... but man in his uncultivated, unsocial aspect, ... In a word, man who is not yet a true species being, end quote, Marx. Footnote. Quote, just as man, so long as he remains in the grip of religion, can only objectify his essence by transforming it into an alien, fantastic being, so too, under the sway of egoistic need, can he only act, only produce objects, by placing his products and his activity under the domination of an alien entity and endowing them with the significance of that alien entity. Money, end quote, Marx. Quote, money is the alienated essence of man's labor and existence. This alien essence dominates him and he worships it, end quote, Marx. Footnote. This hypothesis was already put forward by Zeleny, 1962. Rosen, 1983, examines in great detail which thought and formulations originating with Hess appear in Marx's work. However, the view he derives from this, that Hess exerted an absolutely overwhelming influence on the young Marx, seems somewhat exaggerated. While a number of individual ideas are indeed similar, Rosen pays insufficient attention to the differing overall argumentative structures within which these ideas are situated. And footnote. Although On the Jewish Question is anything but anti-Semitic, the latent anti-Semitism that permeated everyday language is also found in Marx, as in most of his contemporaries. For instance, in letters to Engels, which are in many cases replete with disparaging remarks about others, he quite naturally uses terms like Judel or Itzig when referring to Jewish acquaintances who were not held in high regard. For instance, he refers, this is a side note for myself, for instance, he refers in one of the works by Maximilien Rubel, when talking about LaSalle, he refers to him as a Jewish N-word. Footnote, quote, the weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace the criticism of weapons. Material force must be overthrown by material force, but theory also becomes a material force as soon as it grips the masses, ... The criticism of religion ends with the doctrine that man is the supreme being for man, hence with the categorical imperative to overthrow all relations in which man is a debased, enslaved, forsaken, and contemptible being, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Marx therefore consistently concludes, quote, just as philosophy finds its material weapons in the proletariat, so the proletariat finds its intellectual weapons in philosophy. And once the lightning of thought has thoroughly struck this naive soil of the people, the emancipation of the Germans into human beings will be accomplished. ... The emancipation of the German is the emancipation of man. Philosophy is the head of this emancipation, and the proletariat is its heart. Philosophy cannot realize itself without the abolition of the proletariat, and the proletariat cannot abolish itself without the realization of philosophy. End quote. Marx. And footnote. Footnote. Goldschmidt/Lambrecht also point to Marx's studies on the French Revolution, which led him to the realization that a revolution can only take place if a revolutionary class exists. They therefore view Marx's definition of the proletariat's role primarily as an argument based on historical analogy. End footnote. Footnote. In this respect, one must agree with Mater when he writes, quote, class struggle, and the proletariat are the concepts that begin to break open the anthropological framework of argumentation, end quote. Mater, M-A-D-E-R. However, Mater's subsequent statement, quote, it is no longer exclusively the contradiction and alienation between individual existence and species existence that govern the historical and social theoretical explanation, end quote. Mater fails to recognize that these new concepts are still conceived entirely on an anthropological basis. While they do represent an explosive charge for this foundation, the actual detonation has by no means yet taken place. End footnote. Footnote. The excerpts from Ricardo and Mill were not produced, as is long assumed, before Notebook 3, but most likely only after it. That is, after work on the economic and philosophical manuscripts had been concluded. This sequence demonstrates firstly that Notebook 1 of the manuscripts, this sequence demonstrates firstly that Notebook 1 of the manuscripts, the concluding section of which contains the famous passages on alienated labor, is essentially a critical engagement with Smith, and secondly that one cannot find here any further elaborations on the passages regarding alienation found in the Mill excerpt. End footnote. Footnote. Marx divided the manuscript pages of the first notebook into 3 columns, assigning them the headings, quote, wages, quote, profit of capital, and, quote, rent of land, end quote. And Marx likely wrote them almost simultaneously. Margaret Fay, 1986, was the first to point out the significance of the engagement with Smith for understanding the manuscripts and to examine in depth the implications of their external structure for their content. Margaret Fay was able to demonstrate that the flawed understanding of the editors of the first Mega, who published the manuscripts for the first time in 1932, led to a rearrangement of the text that distorted its meaning, a rearrangement which was retained in all subsequent editions. The new Mega was the first to take into account the 3-column structure and the original layout of the text. However, the old presentation, which artificially systematized the text, was also included as a, quote, second rendering, end quote. And footnote. Footnote. In their commentary on the economic and philosophic manuscripts, the Sozialistische Studiengruppen, Zost, highlighted how Marx contrasts the simple law of appropriation, derived from simple commodity circulation, with the capitalist law of appropriation, inferring a contradiction between them. Yet the capitalist law of appropriation actually emerges as a necessary transformation of the simple law of appropriation, as later developed in Marx's Capital. While this is correct, Marx's critique aims at more than just a confrontation between two laws of appropriation. He juxtaposes the worker's entire wretched living situation with the role emphasized by political economy itself as the worker as the creator of all wealth. A significant shortcoming of the Zost commentary is that it interprets the manuscript almost exclusively against the backdrop of Marx's Capital, thereby constantly identifying only thoughts that are either, quote, already fully developed, end quote, or, quote, not yet correctly developed, end quote. This tendency to break the text down into views that are either already correct or still incorrect causes the manuscript's own discursive logic, which differs from that of Capital, to be largely lost. And footnote. Footnote. This title did not originate with Marx, but with the editors of the first Mega. In the countless interpretations this section has received, its connection to the preceding text, the analysis of profit on capital, wages, and ground rent, is usually overlooked. It was not until Margaret Fay, 1986, that this connection became the starting point for an interpretation. She was able to demonstrate convincingly that the section on alienated labor constitutes the culmination of the critique Marx directed at Smith in the first notebook. However, her attempt to interpret the various phases of this critique as an application of a three-stage Hegelian method to Smith is unconvincing. This approach neither does justice to Hegel nor captures the state of Marx's critique of Hegel at the time the manuscripts were written. Tellingly, to substantiate the significance of Hegelian method for Marx's critique of political economy, Fay cites the well-known passage from the afterword to the second edition in Volume 1 of Capital, a passage that is itself sufficiently ambiguous, without taking into account that Marx's critique of Hegel had undergone significant changes in the interim. And footnote. Footnote, quote, man, this is the secret of religion, objectifies his essence and then makes himself the object of this essence, which has been transformed into a subject, a person, end quote, Feuerbach. And footnote. Footnote, quote, the practical production of an objective world, the working up of inorganic nature, is the confirmation of man as a conscious species being, i.e. as a being that relates to the species as its own essence, or to itself as a species being. ... The production is his active species life. This production is his active species life. Through it, nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of labor is therefore the objectification of man's species life. End quote. Marx. Footnote. The socialist study groups, Zost, view this Marxian definition of the human species being as an impermissible generalization of capitalist relations. Quote, the universality of production, by contrast, is merely a late historical result, brought about only through the subordination of production to the compulsion of capital to valorize itself, end quote, Jost. However, this overlooks the fact that Marx proceeds from a much broader concept of labor, for instance, when he emphasizes that man, unlike the animal, is capable of producing according to the, quote, laws of beauty, end quote, and that this concept of labor does not become relevant only within the framework of the capitalist mode of production. End footnote. Footnote. However, this insight is not possible at all times, but rather linked to specific social conditions. Quote, it is only at the final combination of the development of private property that this secret of its However, this insight is not possible at all times, but rather linked to specific social conditions. Quote, it is only at the final culmination of the development of private property that the secret of its reemerges namely, on the one hand, that it is the product of alienated labor, and secondly, that it is the means by which labor is alienated, the realization of this alienation. End quote. Marx. And footnote. Footnote. This also opens up the possibility of a systematic presentation of economic categories. Quote, just as we derived the concept of private property from the concept of estranged alienated labor through analysis, so too can all political economic categories be developed with the aid of these two factors. End quote. Marx. A first attempt at this systematic development may have been impeded in Notebook 2 of the manuscripts, the greater part of which has not survived. And footnote. Footnote. See also Rancière, 1965, in this regard. In this context, Rancière speaks of a play on words based on ambiguity, a, quote, amphibology, end quote. And footnote. Footnote. Quote, thus, if that political economy begins with the semblance of recognizing man, his independence, his self-activity, then in the course of its further development it must cast off this hypocrisy and emerge in all its cynicism, and it does this by, heedless of all the apparent contradictions in which this doctrine entangles it, developing labor as the sole essence of wealth, much more one-sidedly, and therefore more sharply and consistently, and by demonstrating the consequences of this doctrine as being hostile to man. Not only does the cynicism of political economy grow from Smith through, say, to Ricardo, Mill, etc., but they also consciously and positively advance further in their alienation from man than their predecessors. Yet this happens only because their science develops more consistently and truthfully. End quote. Marx. Footnote, quote, the consciousness of God is man's self-consciousness. The knowledge of God is man's self-knowledge. God is the manifest inner nature, the uttered self of man. Religion is the solemn unveiling of man's hidden treasures, end quote. Feuerbach. Footnote, quote, labor, on the other hand, is inhibited desire, a delayed disappearance, or its formal activity. The negative relation to the object becomes the object's form and becomes something enduring. Sorry, I fucking spaced out for a second. Sorry, I gotta get back. I think I got a footnote. Precisely because the object... So let me restart that. I lost my spot. Footnote. Quote, labor, on the other hand, is inhibited desire, a delayed disappearance, or it is formative activity. The negative relation to the object becomes the object's form and becomes something enduring, precisely because the object possesses independence for the laborer. This negative mediating element, or formative activity, is at the same time the individuality or pure, quote, being for self, quote, being for self, of consciousness, which now, through labor, steps outside itself into the element of permanence. Thus the laboring consciousness thereby arrives at the intuition of independent being as itself, end quote. Hegel. And footnote. Footnote. Schopenhauer, and above all Alfred Schmidt, pointed out that Feuerbach too had emphasized the historical nature of human essence. However, they can only refer to isolated remarks, primarily in posthumously published writings, that do not, however, reveal an overarching conception. End footnote. Footnote. From this, Marx derives a program for reformulating the sciences as a whole. Sensuous, parentheses, see Feuerbach, and parentheses, must be the basis of science. Parentheses, see Feuerbach, and parentheses. To me. Fuck, I fucked that up. This is a weird footnote. There's probably something fucked up with the translation, but anyway. From this, Marx derives a program for reformulating the sciences as a whole. Sensuousness, parenthesis, see Feuerbach, in parenthesis, must be the basis of all science, ... Natural science will later subsume the science of man, just as science of man will subsume natural science. There will be one science. Man is the immediate object of natural science. Quote, for the immediate sensuous nature for man is immediately human sensuousness. The social reality of nature and human natural science, or the natural science of man, are identical expressions. End quote. Marx. Such a program had already been briefly hinted at by Feuerbach. End footnote. Footnote. As is evident from the preface at the end of Notebook 3, Marx planned a concluding chapter on the critique of Hegelian dialectics. With the exception of the text in the new Mega, all previous editions have combined these three interpolations into such a concluding chapter. However, the intrinsic connection to the respective context is lost in the process. Since my concern is not with a systematic commentary on the entire Marxian text, but only with the connection between Marx's philosophy of essence and his assessment of Hegel, the three interpolations regarding Hegel are treated together here as well. End footnote. Footnote. Thus Marx sees the significance of the phenomenology of spirit precisely in the fact that, quote, Hegel grasped the self-creation of man as a process, objectification as the loss of the object, as alienation, and as the supersession of this alienation, that he thus grasps the essence of labor and conceives objective man, true because real man, as the result of his own labor. Man's real active relationship to himself as a species being, i.e. as a human being, is possible only if he actually brings forth all his species powers, which in turn is possible only through the collective action of mankind, only as the result of history, and relates to them as objects, something that is initially possible only in the form of alienation, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Footnote. Kratz is indeed correct to emphasize that this, quote, historicity does not represent a, quote, move beyond Feuerbach toward the position of historical materialism of 1845/46, end quote, but rather derives from young Hegelian process-oriented thinking. In any case, however, this historicity clashes with Feuerbach's ahistorical anthropology. End footnote. Footnote, quote, the individual human being taken in isolation possesses the essence of man neither within himself as a moral being nor within himself as a thinking being. The essence of man is contained only in the community, in the unity of man with man. The highest and ultimate principle of philosophy is therefore the unity of man with man, end quote. Feuerbach. Footnote, in a letter dated August 11, 1844, i.e. towards the end of his work on the manuscripts, Marx wrote to Feuerbach, quote, you have, I do not know whether intentionally, provided a philosophical foundation for socialism in these writings. And the writings being referenced are Philosophy of the Future and The Essence of Faith. And the communists have immediately understood these works in precisely this way. The unity of man with man, grounded in the real difference between human beings, the concept of the human species brought down from the heaven of abstraction to the real earth. What is it other than the concept of society, end quote. Marx. No reply from Feuerbach has been preserved. End footnote. Footnote. See also the Mill excerpt, quote, since the human essence is the true community of human beings produce the human community through the exercise of their essence, end quote. Marx. Footnote, one must indeed agree with Motter, 1986, when he observes that, quote, Marx on the one hand presupposes the individual by attributing to him the species essence as a, quote, mute generality, end quote, and on the other hand conceives of sociality as a precondition for the constitution of the individual. Thus, on the one hand, Marx grasps the individual as one endowed with essential powers and capable of sociality, while simultaneously portraying him as an individual who acts within relations, an individual constituted by those relations, and therefore capable of constituting relations, end quote. Marx. To me, Motter. However, while the first aspect cited by Mater is constitutive of the discourse of the manuscripts, the second appears only sporadically and by way of allusion. For instance, in the remark, quote, "Just as society itself produces man as man, so is it produced by him," end quote, Marx. End footnote. Footnote. In the marginal notes to the King of Prussia and Social Reform, the following is stated regarding the social nature of the human being, the, quote, "true community," end quote. Quote, "But the community from which the worker is isolated is a community of a completely different reality and scope than the political community. This community from which his own labor separates him is life itself, physical and mental life, human morality, human activity, human enjoyment, human essence. Human essence is the true community of human beings," end quote, Marx. Footnote. That communism and atheism are merely the necessary mediations of this state is noted elsewhere. Quote, "Atheism is humanism mediated with itself through the abolition of religion. Communism is humanism mediated with itself through the abolition of private property. Only through the abolition of this mediation, which is, however, a necessary precondition, does positive humanism positively beginning with itself, emerge," end quote, Marx. Footnote. See in addition to the passage just cited the following, quote, "The positive abolition of private property as the appropriation of human life is therefore the positive abolition of all alienation, that is, the return of man from religion, family, state, etc., to his human, i.e. social existence," end quote, Marx. Thus Marx does not, quote, end footnote. Footnote. Thus Marx does not, quote, "slip into," speaking of an original non-alien state, as Zost, 1980, suggests. Alienation cannot be addressed in any other way. End footnote. Footnote. Another problem raised by the concept of alienation is the explanation of how alienation came about in the first place. Marx's account is highly speculative. Quote, "The very fact that the division of labor and exchange are forms of private property implies the twofold proof. On the one hand, the human life requires human private property for its realization. That human life required private property for its realization, and on the other hand, that it now requires the abolition of private property," end quote, Marx. Footnote. Already in the manuscripts, Marx tended to equate industrial labor with alienated labor. Parentheses, see Menzel, Menzel, 1977, on the various ways, quote, "industry is used," end parentheses. By focusing here on the producer's immediate relationship with his product and to the person who consumes it, the notion of artisanal production, though not explicitly stated by Marx, inevitably comes to mind. That's something that I always say. In any case, the labor process is still conceived as a purely individual process between human and nature, rather than as a process socialized through the division of labor and the application of technology and natural forces, which is only possible collectively. End footnote. Footnote. Strictly speaking, this is a case of, quote, "speculative empiricism," end quote, parenthesis, as opposed to materialist scientific empiricism, end parenthesis. The same applies to him that Marx notes about Feuerbach in the German ideology. Quote, "In his contemplation of the sensuous world, he necessarily encounters things that contradict his consciousness and his feeling, things that disturb the harmony he presupposes between all parts of the sensuous world, and specifically between man and nature. To eliminate this, he is then forced to resort to a dual mode of perception, a profane one which sees only what lies, quote, plainly at hand, end quote, and a higher philosophical one which discerns the, quote, true essence of things," end quote, Marx. End footnote. Footnote. In most editions of the manuscript, this, quote, preface is placed at the beginning of the text, creating the impression that it is a preface to the economic and philosophic manuscripts. However, this preface obviously refers to a work that has yet to be written, based on the existing manuscripts. End footnote. Footnote. See also the previously cited letter from Marx to Feuerbach dated August 11, 1844, in which Marx emphasizes that Feuerbach gave socialism a philosophical foundation. End footnote. Footnote. Thus Engels speaks of Feuerbach's, quote, "brilliant developments," and Marx characterizes Feuerbach's significance, among other things, as follows, quote, "But just as Feuerbach did in the theoretical realm, French and English socialism and communism represented in the practical realm, the materialism that coincides with humanism, end quote. Marx. In 1867, after rereading The Holy Family, Marx wrote to Engels, quote, that we need not be ashamed of the work, even though the Feuerbach cult strikes one as very humorous, end quote. Marx. 1867. End footnote. Okay, and that is the end of Chapter 3 of Michael Heinrich's The Science of Value. And again, Chapter 1 was titled Anthropology's Critique, the Theoretical Conception of the Young Marx, and it had the headings, Marx as a Young Hegelian, Critique of Hegelian Philosophy, Critique of Politics, Human Emancipation and Revolution, Critique of Political Economy as a Science within Alienation, Human Essence, Critique of Hegelian Philosophy Continued, Communism, Primordiality and Utopia, Moments of Dissolution in Marx's Conception. End footnote. Sorry, I don't know why I said end footnote. I'm in the habit of saying end footnote. But thank you so much for listening.